Good afternoon, I'm Roger Watterson and this is Sunday Opinion. Until recently, most of us thought that commercial slavery is a thing of the past and that it came to an end with the American Civil War and the abolition of slavery in Britain and the Empire in 1833 and the worldwide abolition by 1863, with similar legislation existing in most countries. But a modern-day version of slavery still exists, with more people trapped in it than ever before in one way or another. The last estimate was 36 million. Human trafficking is the fastest growing criminal activity in the world, and it makes in the region of $32 billion a year. Many countries, such as the USA and other Western countries, have a thriving trafficking trade within their own borders and have no need to import people. But as you would expect, some have a worse track record than others. But surely this couldn't happen in Britain. Well, think again. At the end of last year, Will Kerr, the director of the UK National Crime Agency, said that modern slavery and human trafficking in the UK is far more prevalent than previously thought, and it was policing more than 300 operations currently, with cases affecting every large town and city. The agency estimated that there were tens of thousands of victims, and he said that the previous estimates of 10 to 13,000 victims in the UK were found to be the tip of the iceberg, and the more they looked, the more they found. He warned that trafficking into modern slavery was now so widespread that ordinary people would be unwittingly coming into contact with victims every day. This growth in slavery was being driven by international gangs, increasingly recognising the amount of money they could make controlling people within a huge range of economic sectors rather than just dealing in drugs. The key sectors for slavery now include food processing, fishing, agriculture, construction, domestic and care workers, and car washers. Traffickers are using the internet to lure their victims with hollow promises of jobs, education, and even love. Only yesterday there was a news report of a Vietnamese boy who was critically ill after being found at Dover in a Romanian suitcase. And last week the TV news channel Al Jazeera turned the spotlight onto slavery in Britain with a detailed and disturbing documentary in which it revealed that many large companies in Britain, some household names, were failing to tackle slavery amongst their supply chains. Al Jazeera centred its investigation on a car wash in Canterbury, where the workers were filmed cleaning cars for two-day international car dealerships. They were working 12 to 13 hours a day for less than half the minimum wage, with no breaks, and they were charged a day's pay for squalid accommodation in a container. The report also focused on cannabis farms, where electricity worth £11,500 a month is stolen by bypassing the meter, and the sex trade, where a pimp revealed the techniques used to control and exploit the young women brought over to the UK. He doesn't use violence. In his words, why should I slap them when I can use words to destroy them mentally? Well, while some victims are from the UK itself, Nigeria, Vietnam, Poland, Romania, most vulnerable, with Albania at the top of the list. And in a programme first broadcast last year, while she was visiting her family on the island, we met Sister Imelda Poole. She's based and works in Albania, and she's the founder and now president of the international organisation Renata. That's an acronym for Religious in Europe Networking Against Trafficking and Exploitation. She says the problem is right across the world, involving women, men, boys and girls within and across national porous borders. And we must be on increasing guard, even in the Isle of Man, and watch out for the signs. As a young woman, she took holy orders and then went to Manchester University. And after graduation, she worked abroad for a short while, returning to Cheshire to teach in a girls' grammar school in Altrincham. But then she went back to her first love of working abroad with needy communities, starting in Kenya.
Our congregation, called Institute of Blessed Virgin Mary, was founded by Mary Ward 400 years ago plus, and her desire was to found a congregation of women, the same as the Jesuits for men, and the church didn't like this at all. But in fact, in 1996, it took that long. The church allowed us to go back to our charism, and we now have the Ignatian constitutions, bar the priesthood, and in that there is a tertianship training, and that's for a whole year when you've done so many years of mission. So I went to Kenya to do my tertianship, and while I was there, part of it is an experience for about 2 months, and I worked with a very isolated tribe, the Kipsigi tribe, in a place called Kebeneti, with the Charles de Foucault sisters, and I felt drawn to this to really learn from them about being rather than doing. And there, the life of these people in the Kipsigi tribe was totally subsistence. It was extraordinarily poor, and we walked the walk to find chicken one day, to find a chicken, because people were coming for dinner, and we had nothing for the whole time I was there for food except cabbage and ugali.
One thing I noticed, I spent very little time, but a short time in Zambia.
Oh, yes.
And in the process, most of the time was spent in places like Lusaka, which is the city. But we once or twice went out, in one instance, with a doctor on his rounds in the villages.
Yes.
And met up with there quite a number of people who were in a very different walk of life, including some of the women who really lived in literally grass houses.
Yes.
And had nothing, by our standards, absolutely nothing.
Nothing.
But the one thing that came home to me was they were happy.
They were happy, and they were so hospitable. You know, when you visited them in these grass huts, as you call them, you would never leave them without a cup of tea. Never. And sometimes, you know, it would take an hour for them to find milk. But their joy of living, their basic... You see, the joy came from the fact that they were loved, I think. You know, it was tough, and they did cry as well. You know,
when you say loved, by whom?
By the family. The unit of the family was very, very close. And really, where else did they go? But
was there much of an extended family as well?
Totally, the whole of the compound would have had many huts that were extended members. The family was very big, very, very big. And I was there during the time of the. Sadly, the circumcision for both boys and girls. I witnessed this horrendous situation, but what happened was the boys and the girls were kept apart for about 2 or 3 weeks for healing, and there was just 2 Kenyan sisters and myself in this little community, and we would go out visiting the girls, make the most of the opportunity for healing and conversation during this very difficult time. But at the end of the 2 weeks, we had what was going through the gate ceremony, and all the men would sit in a circle with a long pipe which they'd share, you know, and the girls and the boys would only have worn goat skin for that time of healing. And then as soon as the going through the gate ceremony had taken place, the boys had already had a hut made for them, and they lived apart in the compound, wider. So the extended family got bigger and bigger. They then were allowed to choose a girl, and very, very early marriage. And
did the girls have much say in the matter?
No. Oh no. It was cool when you say. That's why I was saying, you know, they're happy, but there's a deep sadness. We had girls banging on our so-called door. It wasn't really a door, but really begging us to get it stopped, that they would be circumcised. And we went to...
Still going on, though.
It's still going on, of course it is, yes. It's terrible. One of our sisters in Kenya has spent nearly the whole of her mission with a team fighting the law against this in Kenya.
Well, Kenya is, and these African countries, some of them very similar. Tribal customs are similar, I think, from one tribe to another in some respects. But when you went back to the United Kingdom, the northeast of England is a very different animal.
Oh, yes. It's very different. We lived in a 3 generations unemployed council estate, and 3 generations unchurched.
And closures of steelworks and coal mines and
all of that, yes. It was a very cruel environment of poverty and rejection. They were the dropouts of the housing estates in the peripheral, better areas, if you like.
Now, they're not necessarily happy.
No, and neither were the Africans necessarily happy, but they were much more happy than the northeast, because they had community. In Africa, you sensed vibrant community. I can remember going with some of our locals from the northeast to a big gather in England of grassroots survival living, it was called. And people came from peripheral estates from all over the country to look at why their situation was so bad and what was the reality, if you like, to share the stories. And to that came 3 people from Peru. And this is what struck me, and this is the answer to your question. And they gave stories from the barrios. They gave stories as an academic who researched about life in the barrios in Peru, and somebody that was living in Lima. And you know, they were the mentors, the listeners for the whole week of the UK people living in poverty on estates. And at the end of the week, they were asked to sum up the difference between the poverty in Peru and the poverty in the UK on these estates. And to a person, they just said, loneliness. Loneliness. You have shouted out your loneliness, your isolation, your misery, not to do with money, but to do with you have no community, even on these estates. The way you've talked, you're not really working together, sharing together, building life together. And that was very sad for me to hear.
It is a European thing, isn't it? If you look at some of the areas where the steelworks have closed, like Longwy in the Alsace-Lorraine area,
yes,
they're still, 25, 45 years after they closed, they're still having the same issues.
Absolutely, and I don't know what the answer is here. It somehow needs a, as in Albania really, for the rich and the poor to come together and share a decent life in the UK, it needs a huge cultural shift.
Now, what took you to Albania? You've mentioned it there now. Did you go straight to Albania from the northeast of England?
Just a short period of study. What I did was a study of the theology and mission to understand the difference between mission in your homeland and mission abroad, because I felt that I needed to understand that. So yeah, within a year I was in Albania. Our congregation made a decision corporately to open a foundation, a community outside the boundaries of every province in the world. So over that year of 2005, 2006, we founded about 10 new communities all over the world, in Ghana, South Sudan, East Timor,
So when
Seychelles.
you say communities, can you identify that?
Yes.
You're not talking about villages, are you? You're talking about
No.
people of us like mind.
Yes, it meant that we, as sisters, a congregation, we would send some sisters from that province, which was for us England, to another country outside the boundaries. So Ireland sent to South Sudan, England sent to Albania, Australia sent to East Timor, Kenya sent to Ghana, and so on.
So you ended up in Albania.
I ended up in Albania, yeah.
And how long have you been there?
12 years now.
Right. And
12 years.
so what is there about Albania that keeps you there?
I think it's the mission itself.
It's a long time, 12 years.
Yeah, I think when you work at grassroots, as I found in the northeast, nothing is fast, everything is slow. And if you're going to really work at grassroots, you have to listen. You know, part of the mission, in fact the fundamental core of the mission, is listening to the needs of the people, and they lead the mission, not you. So for me, I spent, the first thing was we went to Albania 3 times before we went there to discern, was it the right place to be in? And we went to see the Archbishop of Tirana, and we said to him, if we did come here, what would you want us to do? And he immediately said, there is a crisis here of trafficked girls, you know, and you need to respond to that need and maybe come here and open a shelter for returned victims of trafficking.
So where does this organisation you now represent, Renata, come in?
Well, that comes in because working in the mission of anti-trafficking meant that we were setting up a shelter, working with Caritas initially, before we opened a foundation called Mary Ward Loreto, which is totally focused on anti-trafficking in Albania, with many projects, working with many people. But very early on, this sister in Italy, called Eugenia Benetti, got the funding from the ambassador at the Vatican for the Holy See, for a conference to gather religious from all over the world to look at the mission of anti-trafficking. And I was asked by the Conference of Religious in Albania to represent them in Rome at this conference. And this led to another, and that led to an international network being established.
Right.
But in every continent of the world except Europe, there was a network of religious and co-workers working against trafficking. The key thing was that 3 of us were at this international gather, and knowing that there was no European network, we invited the Union of Major Superiors in Europe to come to London for a meeting, and from that meeting we founded the European network called Renata.
Well, we've been talking already about human trafficking.
Yes.
What is it?
Trafficking is the forced removal of one person to another place, maybe initially by wooing them, and it may not seem like force, but it's a corrupt, discreet collusion with other traffickers to get this person to do something which is against their will, and to exploit them by taking money from them for the labour that they're going to do by selling them off. There are 3 B's in trafficking. There's the bought, there's the buyer, and there's the business. So the bought is the man, boy, girl or woman who is sold off by another to be exploited for some form of trade.
We're talking about slavery. Aren't we,
Yes,
really?
totally slavery. Yeah.
Far more now, by the sound of it, than when it was abolished in 1863 in Britain. I mean, we're talking about millions of people here, aren't we?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I think
It's not just in places like Albania, though. It's all over the world.
no, it's in every. I think it's here. It could be in any country of the world, any place in the world. Trafficking is plying its trade. Yeah.
Reading it up a little, it's the highest $1 billion, to use Americanism, transnational criminal business after drugs. We're talking about an enormous criminal background to all of this.
Huge, huge.
So we must have some significant support in some of these countries to be able to do it. By support, I even mean from those who should know better.
You're absolutely right. We have absolute evidence. We have absolute evidence that in many countries the police are involved at high level. We have absolute evidence that some mayors, members of governments are involved. There is absolutely no doubt. And you know, another thing that I think needs to be considered is this multi-billion-dollar trade. Where's the money going, really? And when traffickers are picked up, what happens to the assets? Why is it such a difficult thing to get law changed and made really on the side of the victim and witness protection?
Well, that's what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Who's profiting out of all this?
Well,
the recent figures show that the industry as a whole is worth about $33 billion per annum. Somebody must be getting something out of that.
Absolutely. And I think governments, forgive me for saying, but I think some governments are getting very rich on the back of that.
Well, they won't be taxing it, will they?
Absolutely not. And all of that money should be going to protect the victims, for rehabilitation, for honest, ethical use of those funds. But they're disappearing. We don't know where all these billions are going when they're picked up.
Well, how are these victims, I think we call them victims, how are they recruited then? Even in the first instance, there's a whole, as I see it, there's problems of trafficking for the sex trade, but there's also trafficking for forced labour.
Absolutely. I mean, we had a training for our members of Renata on labour trafficking in Romania. One of the key developments in trafficking, especially for labour, is the use of the internet and illegal agencies, labour agencies. So if you take an example of Romanian young men desperate for work, they see the adverts on the internet, they're interviewed, they want to go one place, but they're persuaded, say, to go to Cyprus. And in Cyprus, they find that they're trafficked, their passports are taken from them, they're not getting anything but a meagre amount of food, they're being told they have to pay back for their travel to Cyprus, and they're kept in terrible conditions, you know. They're kept in rooms where there might be 20 bunk beds, and the bunk beds are used in a tier way, 3-4 people sleeping in a day in the one bed, and so on, and it's just diabolical, the conditions for these traffic victims.
So the inducement in the first place was one of a better life?
Always they're looking for a better life. Yes.
Not the threat or use of force?
Not initially. Once they are trafficked, there is threat, there is brutality. And you know, you've got the situation of, you talked about organ trafficking and that you know, labour trafficking can lead to all sorts of other kinds of exploitation. So you might be working even with a meagre wage, passport's gone, but the other knockoff, it could be that you are exploited sexually.
So these people, coming back to the labour bit for a moment, these people, obviously their labours are not all used by the people who've coerced them in the first place. They must be selling them on. So there must be a willing buyer as well.
There are many willing buyers, yes, because the buyers are also the traffickers. They are on another level of trafficker. So if I could tell you a story of a girl, true story, a girl from Albania living in a village. She's refused by her father to go on to high school. Bright girl. She goes to the shop each day to get the food she's meant to work. The trafficker is watching her. The trafficker woos her, eventually gives her a mobile. She hasn't got a mobile. She thinks she's made it. She continues the relationship. Eventually he says, would you like to go to Italy? She's still being loved with presents, and she thinks, what an escape. She thinks he's really in love with her. He gets her to Italy and puts her in a flat. He loves her. He woos her still. He doesn't do anything bad. And he gets her from there. He says his job is gone. She has to travel further through France. Eventually arrives in the UK. Absolutely true, this. She arrives in the UK, and in the UK she's sold to another trafficker. Well, she's bought.
Apparently, as you probably know, the Isle of Man at one time was a major contributory factor to the original slave trade. And yes, and it was interesting to see that the cost of a slave in 1850 was about $40,000.
Gosh, that's
and
huge.
now apparently it's about $100.
Yes.
Not worth very much on the open market
no,
now.
it's so sad. But actually this girl was sold for $500 in the UK. But it's still nothing.
Well, it's all of this money, but when a victim, what is their chance of getting out? What's the rescue rate?
Well, if you take the two scenarios, one, say, of the labour trafficking in the, say, agricultural, like the cockle sellers that were picked up here, or you take the girl that was sexually exploited and raped and abused and made to have 10 to 20 men a day, that girl, or some girls, are rescued by a client, you know. They get very sick and they're actually, a client sees that they're not there freely, and the girl will beg a client to help her be rescued. And in the scenario I was telling you about, the client stayed in the room for 40 minutes while he got the girl out of a window, and she ran to the police and is in a shelter now.
That could be out of the frying pan into the fire, of course, couldn't
could
it?
Have been, could have been. It could have been, but it wasn't for her.
Well, you're touching on sex trafficking there, and you're talking about being forced to have sex at numerous times a day in this instance. Recently, in the United States alone, it is said that over 100,000 people are exploited by sex trafficking in every given year without even crossing the borders. So it's homegrown.
Absolutely, yes. This is in every country. There's domestic trafficking here in Britain.
So 22%, this is the statistic I was reading, of all victims are forced into sex work, and the majority, over 70%, are into forced labour. 22% of children? So there are children doing this as well.
Oh yes, terrible.
Well, how on earth can children come to a country and work in a labour like this and the authorities not notice it or know about it?
This is the big question. You know, how are the traffickers getting away with such a high level of criminal gang crime? It's almost incredible to believe it could be so, but it is. And why? We go back to who's getting rich and who's staying poor in these situations. And it's difficult to know because, you know, the deep internet and the way in which it's the most clandestine crime ever in the history of the world, according to the statistics.
So there's this sort of underground, it's like an underground hidden crime in some ways, isn't it? But the victims rarely seem to come forward themselves to seek help.
You know, the problem is not that the victims don't come forward, which many don't, because the criminal gangs threaten their families. Most of the traffickers are known in the local scenario, so they know the families of the victim. And when the victim is in the clutches of the traffickers in terms of having to ply the trade, whether it be sex trafficking or other forms of labour, if they do get rescued and they do begin to threaten, it's incredible how they soon get to know their families are threatened. We had a situation where a girl was asked to come back to Albania because her brother had been murdered. Because of the denunciation she was making in Britain, she's continuing to do so. Good for her.
But so there's a fear of the traffickers?
There's a fear of the traffickers, and also there's a problem with the law, you know.
What, a fear of the law?
No, not for the trafficker, but there is a problem with the law for conviction and for denunciation. So the law is a bit muddied in most countries between the law of illegal migrancy, the law of being trafficked, and the law of kidnapping and smuggling. Yeah. So there's a lot of laws that are overlapping, and it's proof. It's very difficult to get to the end of the line and prove.
We'll take a short commercial break at this point in the conversation with Sister Imelda Poole.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
This is Sunday Opinion, and today we're revisiting a programme first broadcast in 2017 with Sister Imelda Poole, who's the president of Renata, an organisation based in Albania that's working against trafficking and exploitation. Well, the people who are targeted then, are they relatively normal people, or are they susceptible people?
They're susceptible. The ones in our shelters, they've all come from dysfunctional families. They've come from poverty or orphaned situations. I mean, that would be the case in Britain, I think. A lot of them have come from care. You know, they're vulnerable children.
So there are trafficked people in Britain then?
Yes.
Right.
Thousands.
And what are they?
In Britain,
well, they won't be working in factories, will they? So what are they doing? They're in the sex trade, are they?
No, not all. A lot of trafficked victims are working in places like Boston, in the lettuce fields.
Oh, yeah.
They're working in car washes. That's for sure. We know some have been picked up from the car washes. They'll be working in the pornography world, not in the direct sex trade, but in they're being abused in the deep internet through pornography. They're also we haven't know whether you've heard of benefit fraud trafficking, where whole families are being trafficked to another country and then given illegal documents, and they go for benefits, and the benefits go to the traffickers. I think Britain suffered from a lot of this.
It would be very clever to do that.
They are highly intelligent. They are highly intelligent. How could they do what they're doing if they weren't?
Must have no particular sense of. I don't know what the sense is I'm looking for, but there's something missing there, isn't it, in their approach to other people. Yeah. But all of this, if it's known as going on, we're talking about it now, you know it's going on. I'm sure every country in the world then must know it's going on in this instance.
We know that from the international meetings.
Yes, and the United Nations seem to make a great deal about it, and I was having a look at some documents I found for the European Union. There's copious, there's numerous documents from the European Union.
And do you know the SDGs that came out in 2015? The Strategic Development Goals, there were at least 3 now that are actually directly hitting trafficking.
Yes. Yet have all this potential legislation, all this international agreement, and it still goes on.
Yes, I mean the thing that seems to be at the crux of it is that there isn't a global goodwill. If there were, the laws would be corporately against.
They're not all that effective then, are they?
No.
Or can you point to any that are?
The latest, most effective, as we can see who work in the field, is the new French law, which has adopted the Nordic model of criminalising the client. It is in sexual exploitation, but it's also got protection for the victim, and that's only for the sexual exploitation.
How would I recognise the signs? If I met up with somebody in a car wash, for instance, and we've got a few over here, how would I know that what would give me the clue that perhaps all is not well?
I think the clue that you would have is the misery of the car washers. There's something about, I remember somebody working in a shelter in the UK who actually worked with the police in convicting a trafficker at a car wash, and she said it really stood out, and many a client using that car wash needed to report because the actual workers were not well clothed, they were thin, they were miserable, there was no camaraderie going on there. It wasn't a normal place of work at all. It was isolation. Yeah.
In one of the documents I read, I think it was yours, you said that you thought that tourism, there's a role in tourism in helping and identifying this. How does that
Very
work?
good, yes. In fact, there are whole different groups of people that could help against trafficking. And one is the hoteliers, which is part of the tourist trade, because often hotel rooms are used by the traffickers to ply their trade in sexual exploitation. So that's one area. Also, we've got a very, very big problem around the world in domestic labour, and that's a very, very high level form of trafficking, where agencies are selling off victims to work in hotels.
And these must be legitimate agencies then?
No, most of them are illegal. We were working with Filipino girls that had obviously been trafficked.
And are we talking still in Britain? Or
No,
just
Albania.
In Albania now?
In
right,
Albania
okay,
this.
yeah.
But obviously it could be anywhere in the world if it's there. But these girls, we discovered, had their passports taken from them. And they were working in richer homes in Albania. And these girls were in fact trapped because they were having to work huge numbers of hours a day, getting hardly any wage at all. All the contracts they'd made in the Philippines in these agencies had been broken. We managed to get the girls out, these two, and secretly into a shelter for safety. We got the name of the agency, and I was doing some work in the Philippines around that time for about 2 months. So while I was there, I contacted one of my colleagues that works at the international level in anti-trafficking in Manila, and I gave her the name of the agency. She tracked it down, and it was illegal. It was an illegal agency. We got the Filipino embassy from Italy to come to Albania, and they come now regularly to check that all these Filipinos that are coming in and out are coming through regular agencies. But the illegal agencies are multitudinous. They're huge numbers.
Well, if you talk to quite a few police people in different countries, they'll tell you that they need to be as good a criminal as the criminal.
Yes.
They have to be able to understand how he thinks, and if necessary, try and be a step ahead of them occasionally. Because there's some very clever tricks, especially in financial crime, which this is what we were talking about at the time. But Theresa May, who has now got a different job, but she was Home Secretary in 2014 in the United Kingdom, and I read a statement of hers which said, and I'm quoting, "Our aim is disrupting, convicting and imprisoning the criminal gangs to stamp out the crime." Well, I wondered whether that wasn't a slightly naive statement, but she also went on to say anti-trafficking is a priority in the United Kingdom. Is that the case, is it?
Really, I do think that the United Kingdom is ahead of many countries in that modern slavery bill that was passed last year. I think it's really looking at protection of the victims. It hasn't covered all the gaps in the law that are protecting the victim in the whole corridors of trafficking that are taking place in terms of labour and organ trafficking and sexual exploitation. But it's an attempt. I think Theresa May is committed to the anti-trafficking work, but I think it's not gone anywhere near enough. There should be laws criminalising clients. There should be much easier laws to convict the traffickers, but it's very hard. There are very, very few convictions in any country, but you'll find that England, UK, is quite high up in Europe in the numbers of convictions.
I was about to say, having a law is one
Yes.
thing, but implementing and enforcing it's another.
Well, it's not just that. It's that the more law you have to try and track down, the more the numbers will go up. So it doesn't mean that that country has more trafficking, which it does have a great deal in Britain, say, but it could mean that other countries are not bothering to convict or to get a law to convict.
Is it still a growth industry, would you say?
Definitely. I would absolutely be sure of it.
Would you agree with the figure I found? It said there's about 30 million people in different countries caught up in this.
We would say 32 million at the moment. Yeah.
So a significant number.
I think what I'd like to mention is about border trafficking. On all the borders, people are waiting in their thousands to get through a border, and the traffickers are plying their trade on those borders because there's such vulnerability, and they think they're going to be given a chance out, but they're often exploited for sex, the women on the borders. And we know about this on the border of the refugees coming into Spain, but also it's a terrible situation coming from Libya. And I was in Palermo not long ago at a really poor shelter for miners that had been rescued the week before from the Mediterranean, and I still weep in my heart seeing these young people where they obviously hadn't got enough money in Palermo to give them enough clothes, and they were saying they were trying to live off $1 a day in that place. So I would say I would call on governments all over the world to really look at the situation of the most vulnerable, which is the refugees who are being trafficked.
Now the Isle of Man, one hopes, is not caught up in all of this. Who knows, but we hope not. And the Isle of Man government is, compared to some of the governments that you're talking about, quite small, and it has, by comparison, fairly tight budgets. But what can we do?
I looked at the Isle of Man, on Google just to see where it was in this sort of place of the law. What I do know is that they're following the UK and adopting it into the Parliament here, and they've got an eye out. The Isle of Man is named as good and having an eye out for their traffic victims, which is great. What I would say is that they really need to look at what's going on quietly in the hotels, in the tourist industry here, and in the situation of their migrants. You just need to look at it. Maybe nothing is happening, there's no evidence, but it's highly likely that there is.
Well, this is you operating wearing a religious hat, and you've got all sorts of groups of people. You have groups from different European countries. You have the whole object of the exercise is the same wherever you came from. And there's a core of people working very hard to deal with what is a considerable international problem. But that brings me back to the point a little bit earlier on. You may have some successes, and you may be able to point to them. But it's obviously your successes are going to be limited in comparison to what a group of national governments working together could achieve. So that brings me back to the question is, if it's identified, why is it not happening?
It goes back to, I think, what we were saying, that it has to be global goodwill. The governments have to desire to rid the world of this terrible, uncivilized, decivilizing of the human race by allowing it to happen, the selling, the buying of people. So why aren't governments doing it? We go back to, I'm sure it's to do with greed. I'm sure greed is at the heart of all of this. Consumerism, the desire for the governments to turn a blind eye maybe, or there's not enough corporate goodwill to fight this cause or as opposed to that cause, and is the energy put into becoming richer and more safe in their own environment? This is the governments themselves, government ministers. Why? I mean, our question is why? We have had meetings of police from all over the world. I've been at them, where police have come, chief of police have come from all over the world to fight this terrible crime. But I've been at meetings where cross-border ministers have come together, but still the law is not really seriously addressing the problem.
It's a lip service.
The law has got to address the problem.
Or is it because
it's got to be implemented?
Don't know what to do? You put your finger on it earlier on. It's almost like drugs. It's very difficult to track the sources and track the people, isn't it?
It's the clandestine part of it, and it's also the traffickers. I remember being at the OSCE meeting in Brussels, and they said it's almost impossible to keep up with the manner of the traffickers' tracks and in very intelligent ways in which they're doing the crime.
Would one of the answers maybe, is instead of tackling the people who are trading, is to tackle the circumstances which allow the people themselves to enter into this situation, because it seems to me you're talking about things like dysfunctional families and economic poverty and all sorts of other things like political instability, neglect in the family. I could go a list of things I can think of. Maybe that is an easier source to tackle, an easier route to tackle.
Well, all the work of Mary Ward Loreto in Albania and many of us across Europe are giving our major energy to prevention. So we're working with 3,000 women in the vulnerable parts of Albania for human and economic empowerment. We also have a men's project. We have now about 1,000 men involved, and we're looking at systemic change and cultural change from patriarchy to gender awareness, gender equality, and looking at the poverty of these men too, and they have problems.
Now you're operating quite a complex service here.
Yes.
With a variety of different people, and I presume you have a mix of skills within that organisation as well. Where do you get the money from to do it?
This is a very good question, because we have 19 staff in Mary Ward Loreto Foundation in Albania, psychologists, social workers and so on, all very professional who need wages. And the work itself, setting up businesses, we have 17 businesses with these women. You know, it costs a lot. So how do I get the money? How do we get the money? First of all, we have a lot of training of the staff in fundraising. We have a very, very, very good European foundation who always wishes to remain anonymous, who has seen our work and loves what we do at the professional level that it's done, and especially in the work of prevention. And they fund us yearly, and we account and write reports. We apply for funding to 5 or 6 others. I mean, we never have enough. It's hard work. Every 6 months, every month we're having to put in applications to make sure we have enough money.
A lot of your attentions are
hard.
off the ball sometimes in the case you're having to get money.
But you just have to trust in the work and keep going,
Well, if you look back over these years, let me ask you 2 questions, if I may. One is, how effective do you think you've been?
I think with the prevention work, I think we've been very effective. I think it's been amazing to see women, girls, who never came out of their houses. And I remember the first groups we had. The first group was up in the mountains. Albania is 60% mountains. It was way up in the mountains, and there were 60-odd women there. And of those, only 2 had chosen their husband. And of those young women, most of them hadn't seen their husbands for years because they'd gone to Greece and they left. They were hardly speaking. And it's just fantastic to see now. This is, say, 6 years on. We've made a film, and it's called Hope, Mary Ward's Hope for Women. And it's just, it makes you weep, really. And we had a conference in March to celebrate the success of these women. And the film really would make you weep to see these women talking about the past, the present and the future, as if the dream is being born for them.
So what's been the most rewarding for you?
I think it's to see the women just blossom and have a voice. And they're even doing broad-based organising, you know, community organising, and getting school buses for their girls to go to school down the mountains. And they're looking at getting roads built where they'd never had a road, just a path, you know, a rockety path in the mountains. They're standing tall. And the youth, as we have a big youth project, and to see the youth being employed, it's just amazing. To actually,
at what? If there were no jobs before, how are they becoming employed?
Because they're being trained, and we're encouraging businesses that have experience, work experience, and they see how good they are, and they take them on. And the other kind of really big sign of hope is when the victims themselves that we are in shelters and we're working with, to see them come through post-traumatic stress, to get physically well, no teeth, beaten up, to see them somehow, and they may be pregnant when they come to us, have the baby, find their way, get vocational training, get a job, eventually get a flat or get reconciled with the family. And one of these victims has a law degree now, and she's a lawyer working against trafficking. So there are good stories. They're small, but they're very, very powerful.
Sister Imelda Poole, thank you for being our guest on Sunday Opinion today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm grateful.
In today's Sunday Opinion, we heard again the conversation with Sister Imelda Poole, which was first broadcast in May last year. The programme was produced by Catherine Nichol. I'm Roger Watterson, and we look forward to your company once again at 1:15.